One of the more unnerving passages in the entire canonical tradition is today's Gospel. Gospel of Mark chapter 3, where the Lord talks at length about sins against the Holy Spirit. And the reason why it's so troublesome is because the Lord himself says that these sins cannot be forgiven. So in particular, what he says is whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never be forgiven, but instead is guilty of an eternal sin. So again, yikes, right? Now, fortunately, St. Thomas Aquinas comes to rescue. So as you might recall, we believe in the Trinity, one God but three divine persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And more to the point, Aquinas says that when it comes to divine action, even though it's true that whenever God acts, he always acts in unison. So the Father, for example, never acts apart from the Son and the Holy Spirit. At the same time, when it comes to certain actions tend to be attributed to certain persons within the Blessed Trinity according to their particular characteristics. So, for example, we often hear that the Father creates, the Son is sent, and the Holy Spirit strengthens, encourages, and consoles. Now, the same principle applies when it comes to sin. So whenever we commit sin, whenever we offend God, we always offend God in its entirety. But at the same time, we tend to sin against particular persons of the Blessed Trinity. So, for example, think about the Father. The Father is emblematic of power. And so he's typically associated with sins of weakness. Think about sins involving the passions, so the sexual faculty or anger or whatever the case may be. We commit these sins of weakness because of some defect in our character or our constitution. So sins of weakness associated with the Father, who is emblematic of power. The Son is emblematic of truth. So he's typically associated with sins against the truth or sins against wisdom. So, for example, think about sins against the truth of the human person, various sins involving social justice, so failures to love in terms of my dealings and relationships with other people. Now, you pause and you think about the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is emblematic of the good, the diffusion of God's goodness into the world. So therefore, what's the sin against the Holy Spirit? What's the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit? The sin against the Holy Spirit is a sin committed specifically against the good. So I'll give you a couple examples just to kind of flesh it out. So one example of a sin against the Holy Spirit is what we might call despair. So when you think about despair, it's not simply being sad. It's not simply feeling discouraged because, for example, I don't feel like I'm making progress in the spiritual life. Despair, in a certain sense, is like, look, I give up. I give up, I stop trying because I don't believe, for example, that God's grace and God's mercy is bigger than my struggle and bigger than my sin. I don't believe in the power of God, so again, I stop trying, I give up. That, in a nutshell, is despair. Now, think about this idea of presumption. A lot of times when we think about presumption, we think presumption is like, look, I can sin knowing I can go to confession in the future. That's not really presumption, that's just a fact. Presumption is like, I don't feel like I need recourse to God's mercy because I don't need his mercy. There's perhaps the reality of sin, which I believe in as a concept, but I'm a good person, so I don't need God's mercy. I don't need his forgiveness. That is more what we're talking about when we talk about presumption. Third example, envy. That might sound kind of weird, but it's a particular type of envy. So we're not talking about, like, I feel bad because my neighbor has a nice car, or maybe has a bigger house. A particular type of envy where I'm grieved, I'm upset, perhaps I'm angry in the presence of the good. So here's the good, and it provokes something evil and wicked in my heart. That's what the Lord is highlighting here. There's something kind of diabolical about that. So to use a couple of examples, think about today's gospel. Gospel of Mark chapter 3, right? What provokes this lengthy discussion about sins against the Holy Spirit, blasphemies against the Holy Spirit? Jesus, he casts out demons. He does this objectively good thing. He liberates the people of God in this particular moment in time and space from demonic possession. And in response, the scribes and the Pharisees are not happy. They're not overjoyed, but they're mad. They're filled with murderous rage, and they want to destroy the Messiah. So evil in their hearts provoked by the presence of the good. To give you a more contemporary example, think about how many times we are upset or bothered or irritated by other people Not because they're evil, not because they're wicked, not because they're bad, but precisely because they are good. And so perhaps their words, their example, their mere presence reminds me of my need to change in a very particular way, whereas at the same time, I don't really want to change. And so it's easier for me to say, well, that person's difficult, or that person's annoying, so I avoid that person's presence. Just to think it through, again, it happens all the time. It's easier in a certain sense to hang out with friends who simply confirm us in our prior convictions and perceptions of the world, who agree with the things that we say they should agree with, who hate the people we say they should hate. It's more difficult at times to be in the presence of people who are good. Again, people whose words, whose example, whose presence calls us to greater things. It's a soul-searching question, right? When you find yourself in the presence of these people, are you bothered? Do you avoid these people's presence? Are you irritated by the presence of the good? If so, that's what the Lord is talking about here. The deadly sin of envy in a subcategory of blasphemy or a sin against the Holy Spirit. Now, at this point, I kind of want to qualify everything we've been saying thus far. So I think a lot of times, whenever people hear about this particular subject, sins against the Holy Spirit, blasphemies against the Holy Spirit, they tend to be kind of superstitious. So it's not like if I commit this sin, then therefore game over. It's not like that, right? But make no mistake, if you're in this space of sins against the Holy Spirit, blasphemies against the Holy Spirit, if you are saved, it is simply by the grace of God. It's a sheer act of His mercy, no more, no less, because in a certain sense, you're not really contributing to the game. I'll give you an example. This is from Father Hugh Barber. He talks about St. Paul. So as a matter of background, Paul, before he became St. Paul, he was Saul. And who was Saul? Saul was a Pharisee, a very learned guy, studied up and down the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And more to the point, he hated Christianity. And so he was known, pre-conversion, for roaming about the countryside, persecuting Christians, beating them, imprisoning them, sometimes even killing them, right? And so if you break it down, what's the nature of his sin? It's not weakness. It's not weakness because Paul was a strong guy. It's not so much a sin against truth because he was a lover of the Torah. It was very much a sin against the good. Sin against the Holy Spirit. Blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. I'm in the presence of the good, and that provokes evil and wicked thoughts in my mind. I'm in the presence of the good, this provokes evil from within, right? So I see Jesus Christ proclaiming salvation to the Gentiles, and I'm irritated. I'm driven to a murderous rage. So it's kind of interesting. What does Jesus do in response to this particular situation? He knocks St. Paul on his ass. That's actually what happens. Acts of the Apostles. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? In other words, you're being a real jerk, Paul. No joke, right? Like, I love you so much, but you were so stubborn. You won't listen to anybody. And you were driven to a murderous rage in the presence of the good? Come on. Right? That's what's happening here. And so he has to do this thing in terms of knocking him down and just kind of knocking some sense into him. So the answer to the question, if you're guilty of a sin against the Holy Spirit, can he be saved? I suppose. But you really want to bet your whole life on someday, maybe, hopefully, in the future, God will knock me in my ass and talk some sense into me. That seems like a terrible gamble. There's a better way. Now, you hold that thought and you think about St. Peter, right? So St. Peter, when you look at the gospel, up and down the gospel, it seems like he screws up like a lot. It seems like, in a certain sense, he screws up more than all the other apostles combined, right? And yet, by the grace of God, this guy becomes this amazing saint, this great witness, this tremendous leader in the church, the first pope. And why is this? Perhaps I might suggest it's because of the nature of his sin. You break it down, what's the nature of St. Peter's sin? There's no hint of malice. There's no sense of an aversion to the truth. Whenever the Lord even looks at him or asks him, Peter, do you love me? He melts, right? His sin is weakness. Sins of weakness. I struggle with fear. I struggle with shame. I struggle with self-hatred and identity wounds, all sorts of identity wounds. And it's kind of interesting. It takes him a while to own that, to own the fact that I'm weak and I am who I am by the grace of God. But eventually, at the end of the day, he does own the fact that I'm weak, but I'm loved in my weakness. And that's the thing that makes him great. Because basically, he becomes this humble guy. Because I recognize who I am, because I own my weakness, now I'm open, I'm docile, I'm teachable. And with a person like that, God can do amazing things.